When we look out at the ocean today, we see a relatively stable and predictable ecosystem. It is a vast expanse of blue that regulates our global climate and supports modern marine life in a delicate, balanced web. But this contemporary view is merely a brief, quiet interlude in the immense scale of geological time. If we rewind the planetary clock by hundreds of millions of years, the seas of Earth were fundamentally alien. These were not the tranquil waters we know, but brutal, hyper-competitive crucibles driven by extreme fluctuations in oceanic chemistry, shifting atmospheric compositions, and violent tectonic disruptions. In the deep past, survival in the water required radical biomechanical adaptations. The prehistoric marine environment was a relentless arms race of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics, where the ultimate evolutionary currency was bite force, hydrodynamic efficiency, and metabolic endurance. The predators that ruled these waters were not just massive anomalies, they were highly specialized biological machines engineered by planetary-scale extinction events and rapidly shifting ecological niches. Understanding their anatomy is not merely an exercise in paleontology. It is a vital window into the physical limits of carbon-based life, demonstrating how extreme environmental pressure forces biology to weaponize itself. Furthermore, it reveals the profound fragility of apex predators when planetary mechanisms such as global ocean circulation or surface temperatures suddenly collapse. These ancient oceans serve as a perfect analog for understanding how life might evolve, dominate, and ultimately perish in liquid environments on other terrestrial worlds across the cosmos. Today, we will explore why the prehistoric ocean was a nightmare, the most dangerous sea monsters of ancient times. Before we descend into the abyss of deep time, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below letting us know exactly where and when you are watching this journey into the past. The Cambrian period, roughly 500 million years ago, represents a fundamental pivot in the architecture of life on Earth. Prior to this era, the ocean was essentially blind. Organisms navigated a dark, tactile world, interacting primarily through chemical gradients and physical touch. The evolutionary arms race, as we understand it, had not yet begun. But when the visual spectrum was finally unlocked, the rules of survival were rewritten overnight. Enter Anomalocaris, widely considered the first true apex predator of our planet. While its meter-long size is often the focal point of its legacy, its most formidable weapon was actually its data processing capability. Anomalocaris possessed extraordinarily advanced compound eyes, situated on stalks, each containing over 16,000 individual hexagonal lenses. This level of visual acuity rivals that of modern predatory insects like dragonflies. The sudden emergence of high-resolution, image-forming vision in the Cambrian oceans triggered what evolutionary biologists call the light switch hypothesis. Once a predator could resolve shapes, judge distances, and track movement in three-dimensional space, prey species were forced into a desperate scramble for survival, leading to the rapid evolution of armored shells and burrowing behaviors. But this mechanism extends far beyond Earth's fossil record. In the broader context of astrobiology, the evolution of the eye is often viewed as a universal catalyst. On any liquid-covered exoplanet situated within a star's habitable zone, the independent evolution of localized photoreception into complex, image-resolving ocular systems might be the mandatory trigger for the development of complex trophic webs. Vision demands immense metabolic investment and forces a rapid expansion of neural processing networks. It is the biological equivalent of turning on radar in a theater of war. Once a target was acquired visually, the physical mechanics of capture came into play, relying on a completely different set of biomechanical engineering principles. The frontal appendages of Anomalocaris were highly specialized, segmented arms lined with sharp, comb-like spines. Hydrodynamically, these grasping structures were not built for slow, methodical movement. Their joint articulation and pivoting base suggest they were designed for rapid, sweeping motions through the water column, minimizing fluid drag while maximizing their area of effect. By snapping these appendages inward, the animal could create localized fluid vortices, effectively trapping fast-moving prey within a hydrodynamic cage before physically impaling them. However, the final stage of this predatory sequence, the consumption of the prey, has recently become the center of a major scientific debate that fundamentally alters our understanding of the Cambrian food web. For decades, paleontologists viewed the oral cone of Anomalocaris, a circular array of overlapping, toothed plates, as a biological nutcracker. The dominant narrative depicted this predator patrolling the seafloor, using its formidable mouth to crush through the hard, mineralized exoskeletons of trilobites. It was a compelling image, but science is an iterative process, and modern observational data often overturns entrenched assumptions. When researchers applied a technique known as finite element analysis to three-dimensional digital models of the Anomalocaris mouth, the classic narrative collapsed. Finite element analysis is an engineering tool used to predict how physical structures react to real-world forces, fluid flow, and physical stress. By inputting the structural properties of unmineralized chitin, the primary material comprising the predator's oral plates, scientists simulated the exact biomechanical forces required to crack a trilobite shell. The results were definitive. The plates could not withstand the necessary structural stress. The mouth of Anomalocaris would have catastrophically fractured under its own bite force. This leads to a deeper, far more complex implication about the ecological dynamics of the era. Anomalocaris was not a heavily armored benthic tank cracking open hard shells on the ocean floor. Instead, it was likely a highly agile pelagic hunter. It stalked the open water column, utilizing its superior vision to target entirely soft-bodied organisms. Rather than crushing, biomechanical evidence suggests its mouth was optimized for a different mechanism entirely. The overlapping plates were perfectly structured to create a rapid pressure differential, allowing the predator to suck in soft prey much like modern pelagic suction feeders. This revised model demonstrates the strict limits of physical morphology. The biological hardware of any organism is bound by the material sciences of its own anatomy. Anomalocaris had reached the absolute mechanical limit of what soft, unmineralized chitin could achieve in a predatory role. As the Cambrian period progressed and prey species continued to invest heavily in calcium carbonate armor, this highly specialized biological machine faced an insurmountable threshold. The very environment had shifted mechanically, leaving the greatest predator of its time biologically obsolete. This dynamic perfectly illustrates a recurring theme in planetary biology. Extreme specialization is often a direct precursor to extinction when the underlying physical parameters of a habitat begin to shift. As the Cambrian gave way to the Ordovician period, the oceans underwent a dramatic restructuring of predator-prey dynamics. The visual arms race of the previous era had initiated a rapid calcification of marine life, flooding the ecosystem with heavily armored organisms. To penetrate these new biological defenses, predators had to evolve beyond the soft mechanical limits of early hunters like Anomalocaris. This immense evolutionary pressure gave rise to the Eurypterids, colloquially known as sea scorpions. These arthropods encased themselves in rigid chitinous armor, essentially becoming the first biological submarines equipped with jointed raptorial appendages. It was a highly successful architectural design that allowed them to dominate the marine trophic webs, setting the stage for a dynasty that would eventually push the absolute boundaries of anatomy. But this armored supremacy came with a fatal, inescapable biological compromise. An exoskeleton provides excellent defense and muscular leverage, but it is fundamentally static. It does not grow with the organism inside it. To increase in mass, an arthropod must periodically shed its rigid casing through a complex physiological process called ecdysis. At microscopic or moderate scales, molting is a routine biological function. However, as the evolutionary arms race pushed sea scorpions to unprecedented sizes, this basic physiological necessity transformed into a lethal mechanical crisis. This crisis reached its absolute physical limit with the subsequent evolution of giant Eurypterids, culminating in apex predators like Jacalopterus. Reaching lengths of over 8 feet, Jacalopterus represents the maximum theoretical size for an aquatic arthropod. At this massive scale, the laws of physics become entirely unforgiving. This brings us to the square-cube law, a fundamental geometric principle stating that as a shape grows, its volume increases exponentially faster than its surface area. For a giant sea scorpion, this meant the internal mass of its body was cubing, while the surface area of the exoskeleton supporting that mass was only squaring. The square-cube law also triggered a severe metabolic crisis regarding oxygen diffusion. Marine arthropods rely on localized gill structures to extract dissolved oxygen from the surrounding water. Because the respiratory surface area could not scale fast enough to match the rapidly expanding volume of oxygen-consuming tissue, a giant like Jaekelopterus operated on the razor's edge of physiological asphyxiation. It required highly oxygenated environments simply to maintain baseline cellular function. During the highly strenuous act of molting, the creature's oxygen demand spiked drastically, precisely at the moment when its delicate respiratory structures were softest and least efficient at gas exchange. The biomechanical reality of molting for a creature the size of Jaekelopterus was nothing short of a structural nightmare. During extinctions, the animal had to fracture its old armor and painstakingly extract its massive, soft-bodied form. In this transitionary phase, it lacked any structural integrity. Without a hardened outer shell, the immense internal volume of fluid and muscle tissue was entirely at the mercy of external hydrostatic pressure and the subtle pull of gravity. The sheer physical exertion required to pull such a massive body free of its old casing carried a high risk of exhaustion, mechanical entrapment, or fatal structural collapse before the new shell could properly mineralize. But the problem does not stop there. A molting Jaekelopterus was not just fighting the laws of fluid dynamics and gravity, it was fighting time. The chemical hardening process of a new chitinous shell at that massive size required vast amounts of metabolic energy and took a considerable duration to complete. During this critical window, the undisputed apex predator of the ecosystem was reduced to a soft, completely defenseless target. This severe biological vulnerability forced giant eurypterids into a slow ecological exile. To survive the molting process, they were compelled to abandon the deep, open ocean, retreating into shallow, brackish estuaries and freshwater river systems. In these environments, hydrostatic pressures were lower, and newly evolving, fast-swimming jawed fish could not easily pursue them. At a planetary scale, the implications of this shift alter our perspective entirely. The retreat of the giant sea scorpions was not merely a local ecological displacement, it was a visible demonstration of a hard physical boundary for carbon-based life. The physiological bottleneck of molting reveals that evolutionary pathways are strictly governed by a planet's mass, gravity, and the density of its liquid solvents. If we extrapolate this mechanism to the field of astrobiology and the search for extraterrestrial life, it provides a crucial filtering concept. On any exoplanet with higher gravity or denser oceans, armored, molting organisms would reach their biomechanical ceiling at much smaller sizes. Extinctions acts as a universal barrier, dictating that intelligent, highly complex alien life in aquatic environments must either bypass the exoskeleton entirely or remain trapped at a restricted, non-dominant scale. Furthermore, the very estuarine environment that provided a sanctuary for Jaekelopterus eventually sealed its fate. By hyper-specializing their biology to thrive in fragile coastal margins and relying on a cumbersome, energy-intensive growth mechanism, these giant arthropods boxed themselves into an evolutionary dead end. When planetary geology inevitably shifted, altering sea levels and wiping out these delicate brackish ecosystems, the giant sea scorpions had nowhere left to migrate. Their rigid biological hardware could not adapt fast enough to the changing geological software of the Earth. If this principle holds true across the cosmos, it suggests that extreme morphological specialization might be one of the silent underlying components of the Great Filter, a cosmic mechanism where life successfully evolves only to engineer itself into an inescapable terminal biological corner. The limitations of the exoskeleton eventually forced the biosphere to innovate a completely different structural paradigm. By the time we enter the Devonian period, roughly 380 million years ago, the evolutionary narrative shifts from external armor to internal scaffolding. This era, widely known as the Age of Fishes, witnessed one of the most consequential biomechanical breakthroughs in the history of our planet: the evolution of the articulated jaw. Before this adaptation, marine vertebrates were strictly jawless, relegated to filtering microscopic nutrients or scavenging organic detritus from the seafloor. The development of a hinged mechanical structure, repurposed from the skeletal arches that previously supported gills, fundamentally rewired the flow of biological energy across the entire global ocean. The undisputed master of this new biological hardware was Dunkleosteus, a massive predatory fish belonging to a now extinct class known as the placoderms. To understand Dunkleosteus is to examine a creature that essentially weaponized its own skeleton. Unlike modern fish, its head and thoracic region were heavily shielded by thick interlocking plates of dermal bone. However, its most formidable feature was its mouth. Dunkleosteus did not possess true teeth made of dentin and enamel. Instead, it utilized elongated, blade-like extensions of its jawbone. As the mouth opened and closed, these bony plates continuously sheared against one another, creating a self-sharpening mechanism that maintained a razor edge throughout the life of the animal. For decades, the exact lethality of this anatomical structure was purely a matter of paleontological speculation based on the sheer size of the fossilized skulls. But the introduction of modern computational tools has completely transformed our understanding of Devonian predator mechanics. Researchers applied finite element analysis to three-dimensional digital reconstructions of the Dunkleosteus skull. Finite element analysis is an advanced engineering simulation method originally developed for testing the structural integrity of aerospace components and architectural bridges under extreme stress. By inputting the estimated material properties of fossilized placoderm bone and mapping the attachment points of its colossal jaw muscles, scientists could digitally calculate the exact biomechanical forces the animal could generate. The data output was staggering. The bite force of a large Dunkleosteus was concentrated directly at the tip of its bony fangs, generating thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch. This localized force was more than sufficient to punch through the heavy calcium carbonate armor of contemporary ammonites or cleanly sever the bodies of other armored placoderms. But the bite force alone was not its most sophisticated weapon. The finite element analysis revealed a hidden genius in the geometry of its skull. The skull of Dunkleosteus operated on a highly specialized biomechanical system known as a 4-bar linkage. Its skull and thoracic armor were connected by movable joints, allowing both the upper and lower jaws to articulate simultaneously. This engineering allowed Dunkleosteus to open its massive mouth in a fraction of a second. In an aquatic environment, fluid dynamics usually works against a predator. Rapidly lunging at prey creates a pressure wave of displaced water that physically pushes the target away. But the high-speed opening of the Dunkleosteus jaw bypassed this physical limitation entirely. The rapid expansion of its oral cavity created an instantaneous massive drop in pressure, generating a localized hydrodynamic vacuum. The predator did not just bite its prey, it sucked the surrounding water and anything caught within it directly into the path of its self-sharpening guillotine. This leads to a deeper, far more profound consequence regarding the architecture of complex ecosystems. The invention of the jaw, paired with the physics of suction feeding, allowed energy to travel up the food chain at an unprecedented rate. Predators could now consume larger, more energy-dense prey, fueling higher metabolic rates and accelerating the evolution of complex nervous systems required to hunt or evade. At a planetary scale, the significance of this mechanism alters our view of life's potential across the universe. The transition from jawless to jawed vertebrates represents a massive leap in trophic efficiency. In the field of astrobiology, when we model the potential ecosystems of subterranean oceans on icy moons like Europa or Enceladus, we must consider this structural threshold. An alien ocean might be teeming with microbial life or slow-moving filter feeders, but without the evolutionary leap to a mechanical hinge designed for macro consumption, that biosphere might remain perpetually locked in a low-energy state. The jaw is not merely a biological feature, it is a metabolic catalyst. It suggests that for a planetary ecosystem to eventually produce highly intelligent, fast-moving organisms, it must first cross a violent biomechanical threshold, completely restructuring how carbon and energy are harvested in a fluid environment. By the end of the Devonian period, creatures like Dunkleosteus had achieved absolute biomechanical supremacy. They had weaponized their internal skeletons, optimized their hydrodynamic strike capabilities, and effectively conquered every tier of the marine food web. But this physical dominance masked a profound underlying vulnerability. Biological hardware, no matter how advanced, is entirely dependent on the chemical stability of the planet it inhabits. Around 359 million years ago, the Earth's operating system underwent a catastrophic systemic crash. This was the Hangenberg event, a planetary-scale biogeochemical crisis that would completely erase the Placoderm dynasty from existence. But the trigger for this marine apocalypse did not originate in the water. It began on land, driven by a seemingly harmless biological innovation. During the late Devonian, the continents were experiencing a radical terraforming process as the very first complex forest ecosystems spread across the landmasses. These early trees developed deep, extensive root systems that physically fractured the continental bedrock, accelerating the chemical weathering of silicate rocks. This terrestrial biological engine acted as a massive planetary pump. It rapidly pulled vast amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, initiating a global cooling phase, while simultaneously flushing an unprecedented volume of raw terrestrial nutrients, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen, directly into the global ocean. At a local scale, an influx of nutrients sounds beneficial for an ecosystem, but at a planetary scale, the meaning of it changes completely. This sudden, overwhelming nutrient loading triggered runaway eutrophication. Massive, explosive algal blooms spread across the surface of the Devonian seas, blocking out sunlight and disrupting the photic zone. When these vast, short-lived algal mats died, they sank into the deep ocean. The decomposition of this staggering volume of organic matter was carried out by aerobic bacteria, which rapidly consumed almost all the dissolved oxygen in the water column to fuel their own metabolic processes. The result was severe oceanic anoxia. The global oceans were literally suffocating. We can read the exact sequence of this global asphyxiation in the geological record. Stratigraphic layers marking the Hangenberg boundary are globally characterized by extensive deposits of black shale. These dark, carbon-rich sedimentary rocks form exclusively in the complete absence of oxygen, perfectly preserving the organic carbon of a collapsed biosphere that could not fully decompose. Isotopic analysis of these shales reveals highly disrupted carbon and oxygen cycles, confirming that global ocean circulation slowed drastically. The oceans stratified, trapping stagnant, oxygen-depleted water in the lower basins. Furthermore, in these deepest, darkest zones, anaerobic bacteria began to thrive, producing massive quantities of highly toxic hydrogen sulfide gas. This chemical shift turned the lower ocean into a literal dead zone, slowly creeping upward toward the surface. And it is right here that this geological mechanism connects to a much larger question about the survival and ultimate fate of apex predators. For a creature like Dunkleosteus, oceanic anoxia was a mathematical death sentence. The enormous bite force, rapid suction-feeding mechanics, and continuous swimming required by these placoderms demanded a massive, uninterrupted supply of metabolic energy. Maintaining that heavily armored, multi-ton biological machine required highly oxygenated water flowing constantly over immense gill structures. When global oxygen levels plummeted, their greatest evolutionary advantage, their sheer, overwhelming mass and heavy structural dermal bone, instantly transformed into a fatal metabolic burden. They were caught in a biological trap. They could not shrink their physical forms fast enough over generations to survive on lower oxygen yields, nor could their heavily weighted bodies easily migrate to the rapidly shrinking, highly competitive pockets of oxygenated surface waters without expending lethal amounts of energy. The evolutionary arms race had optimized them for a high-energy world that simply no longer existed. Their highly specialized anatomy, once the pinnacle of Devonian engineering, became the very anchor that dragged them into extinction. If this mechanism hold true, it speaks not only to the deep history of Earth, but also to the potential future of all complex multicellular biospheres. The Hongenberg event perfectly illustrates a critical component of the Great Filter hypothesis. It demonstrates that life can easily be its own undoing. The evolutionary success of terrestrial plants inadvertently engineered the suffocation of the marine apex predators. In the field of astrobiology, when we search for exoplanets with atmospheric biosignatures, we must recognize that planetary habitability is not a static, permanent state. A biosphere is a chaotic, interconnected feedback loop. A planet might successfully evolve complex, macroscopic life, only for one distinct biological innovation in one hemisphere to accidentally destabilize the global chemical balance, resetting the evolutionary clock for the entire world. The placoderms, despite their impenetrable armor and their devastating biomechanics, were entirely eradicated. They did not leave a single evolutionary descendant. The abrupt deletion of these armored giants left a massive ecological vacuum in the global ocean. The biological hardware of the Devonian was scrapped entirely. This massive loss of biodiversity and the clearing of ecological niches forced the surviving, smaller lineages of cartilaginous and bony fishes to step out of the shadows. To survive in the newly stabilized but forever altered oceans, they would have to experiment with entirely new, increasingly bizarre anatomical architectures, paving the way for the extreme and strange biomechanical trials of the Permian period. The abrupt deletion of the Devonian placoderms left an immense ecological vacuum in the global ocean. Without the heavily armored, bony predators dominating the upper tiers of the food web, the subsequent Permian period witnessed a radical shift in biological engineering. The oceans became a testing ground for cartilaginous fish, lineages that had previously been relegated to the ecological margins. Because cartilage is fundamentally lighter and more flexible than true bone, these creatures were unburdened by the extreme weight of dermal armor. This newfound freedom allowed evolution to experiment with highly unconventional anatomical architectures. Among these bizarre biological trials, one creature represents an absolute extreme in predatory morphology: the Eugeniodontid, known as Helicoprion. For over a century, Helicoprion was one of the most perplexing anomalies in the history of paleontology. Because cartilaginous skeletons rapidly decompose after death, they rarely fossilize. All that remained of this apex predator were isolated, tightly coiled spirals of triangular teeth, resembling biological circular saw blades. Without the context of a skull, early scientific models placed this tooth whorls everywhere imaginable, extending from the upper snout, hanging off the dorsal fin, attached to the tail, or uncoiling from the lower jaw like an elephant trunk. This confusion highlights a fundamental limitation in our reconstruction of deep time, when we only have access to the hardest, mineralized fragments of an organism. Our models are easily distorted by human bias and a lack of comparative modern anatomy. The true architecture of this predator was not resolved until modern, non-destructive imaging technologies were applied to the fossil record. By utilizing high-resolution computed tomography scanning on a remarkably well-preserved specimen discovered in Idaho, researchers finally mapped the internal geometry of the surrounding skull. The data completely overturned earlier hypotheses. Helicoprion was not a true shark, but a distant relative of modern ratfish. More importantly, the scans revealed that the massive tooth whorl was housed entirely within the lower jaw, occupying the entire space of the mandibular arch. It was supported by specialized cartilaginous structures that bracketed the whorl, keeping it perfectly aligned within a narrow groove in the upper palate. But the most fascinating discovery was not just the location of the whorl, but the biomechanical physics of how it operated. Helicoprion lacked functional teeth in its upper jaw, which meant it could not chew or crush its prey in a conventional manner. Instead, the jaw functioned on an entirely unique mechanical principle. As the mouth closed, the complex articulation of the jaw joint forced the entire tooth whorl to rotate backward. The teeth at the front of the spiral were driven inward, continuously cycling fresh, sharper teeth forward. This mechanism essentially transformed the lower jaw into a specialized biological cutting wheel. This leads to a deeper understanding of evolutionary dynamics in a highly competitive ecosystem. Why would biology invent a circular saw instead of standard teeth? The answer lies in the limitations of biological materials. Cartilage simply cannot withstand the massive, repetitive compressive forces required to crush heavily mineralized shells, forces that the bony jaws of Devonian predators effortlessly generated. To hunt effectively, Helicoprion had to optimize for a different type of force, slicing rather than crushing. By targeting soft-bodied cephalopods like ancient squids and early ammonites, the predator could swim directly into a school of prey. As it clamped down, the rotational force of the whirl cleanly severed the soft tentacles and muscular tissue, actively pulling the biomatter directly down its throat, completely bypassing the need to crush the hard exterior shell. At a larger scale, the very geometry of the tooth whirl opens a profound discussion about the intersection of biology and mathematics. The whirl grows outward in a perfect logarithmic spiral. This is a mathematical absolute, a structural geometry that maintains its shape precisely as it increases in size. It is the exact same mathematical curve we observe in the formation of hurricane pressure systems, the spiraling arms of galaxies, and the predictable decay of subatomic particles in a magnetic field. And it is right here that this morphological anomaly connects to a much broader astrobiological question. When we model the potential evolutionary pathways of complex life in extraterrestrial oceans, we often assume they will follow standard, Earth-like terrestrial forms. But the logarithmic spiral of Helicoprion suggests that when biological organisms are restricted by specific material limitations, such as lacking true bone, they may inherently default to universal geometric efficiencies. It raises the possibility that across the cosmos, extreme anatomical structures are not just random evolutionary accidents, but inevitable, predictable solutions to physical problems, governed entirely by the universal laws of thermodynamics and fluid mechanics. However, this extraordinary hyper-specialization carried a fatal systemic risk. Helicoprion was biologically locked into a single, highly specific feeding mechanism entirely dependent on a stable, thriving population of soft-bodied cephalopods. It was a masterpiece of Permian engineering, but it lacked the adaptability required to survive sudden ecological shifts. As the Permian period marched toward its catastrophic conclusion, the environmental parameters of the planet were about to change once again. The biological circular saw was a perfect adaptation for an ocean that was entirely unaware of the greatest mass extinction event in the history of the Earth, an event that would soon render such extreme specialization a distinct evolutionary liability. The extreme anatomical specialization of the Permian period was a luxury afforded by millions of years of relative ecological stability, but 252 million years ago that stability was violently revoked. The Earth entered the most severe biological crisis in its history, the Permian Triassic extinction event, often referred to as the Great Dying. This was not a localized disaster, but a complete systemic failure of the planetary life support system. A massive upwelling of magma in what is now Siberia ignited vast subterranean coal deposits, pumping unimaginable quantities of carbon dioxide and methane directly into the atmosphere. The resulting runaway greenhouse effect triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that fundamentally altered the chemistry of the global ocean. As the oceans absorbed this massive influx of atmospheric carbon, the water underwent severe acidification. This chemical shift dissolved the calcium carbonate structures of the primary reef builders and shelled organisms that form the foundational base of the marine food web. Simultaneously, global warming dramatically reduced the solubility of oxygen in seawater, leading to widespread anoxia. Within a geological blink of an eye, the thermodynamic flow of energy from primary producers to apex predators was entirely severed. Over 95% of all marine species were permanently deleted from the fossil record. But what exactly is left when an ocean is emptied of its inhabitants? This phenomenon introduces the concept of an ecological vacuum. An ecological vacuum is not merely empty space, it is an immense unexploited reservoir of potential biological energy. Before the extinction, the ocean was tightly packed with specialized organisms. each occupying a specific ecological niche and fiercely defending its access to resources. Once those gatekeepers were eradicated, the vast three-dimensional volume of the ocean was suddenly devoid of competition. The trophic pyramid had collapsed, leaving an open frontier waiting to be reclaimed. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this devastation changes completely. The Permian-Triassic boundary represents the closest the Earth has ever come to a total biological reset. In the context of astrobiology and the Fermi paradox, this event serves as a terrifying model for planetary fragility. When we look at exoplanets in the habitable zones of other stars, we must consider that geological volatility might be a universal constant. A planet could easily foster millions of years of complex evolutionary progress, only to have its entire biosphere sterilized by an internal tectonic fluctuation. If hyperthermal events and ocean acidification are common geological cycles on terrestrial worlds, this mechanism could act as a profound great filter, repeatedly wiping out complex marine biospheres before they ever have the chance to evolve true intelligence or technological capability. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, the early Triassic Ocean was a desolate, low-energy environment largely dominated by simple, opportunistic organisms that could survive in hypoxic, stagnant waters. The highly specialized biological machines of the Paleozoic era, the giant armored fish and the cartilaginous circular saws were gone forever. The future of marine dominance would not come from within the ocean itself, but from a completely unexpected source. While the oceans were slowly detoxifying, the supercontinent of Pangaea was experiencing its own severe environmental stress. The interior of the massive landmass was an arid, unforgiving desert, subjected to extreme temperature fluctuations. Terrestrial vertebrates, specifically early reptiles, were locked in a desperate struggle for survival on a barren continent. However, as the edges of the oceans gradually began to recover and the foundational layers of the marine food web slowly re-established themselves through the diffusion of atmospheric oxygen, a new thermodynamic opportunity emerged along the coastlines. This leads to a deeper evolutionary consequence. Nature fundamentally abhors an energy vacuum. Driven by severe terrestrial competition and the allure of unexploited aquatic food sources, small lizard-like reptiles began foraging along the shallow coastal margins. Over millions of years, this simple behavioral shift initiated one of the most remarkable biomechanical transformations in planetary history. To exploit the ecological vacuum of the deep ocean, these terrestrial reptiles would have to completely reverse hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary engineering. They would have to surrender their terrestrial limbs, alter their respiratory systems, and dive back into the very fluid environment their ancient ancestors had fought so hard to escape. This massive evolutionary rollback set the stage for a new dynasty of air-breathing marine predators, initiating a radical era of convergent evolution that would push reptilian biology to its absolute physical limits. The ecological vacuum left by the devastating Permian-Triassic extinction event did not remain empty for long. As the early Triassic period stabilized, roughly 250 million years ago, it marked the beginning of one of the most profound biological inversions in planetary history. Terrestrial reptiles, organisms possessing lungs, 4 distinct limbs, and skeletal architectures evolved explicitly for terrestrial gravity, began to invade the newly emptied oceanic frontiers. But liquid water is an unforgiving medium. It is nearly 800 times denser than the atmosphere. To move through it efficiently, biology cannot simply adapt through minor behavioral adjustments. The entire anatomical framework must be completely overhauled. This immense thermodynamic and hydrostatic pressure drove the rapid evolution of the ichthyosaurs, a lineage of marine reptiles that perfectly illustrates the inescapable, universal laws of fluid dynamics. This morphological transformation brings us to one of the most powerful and predictable mechanisms in evolutionary biology: convergent evolution. When we examine the skeletal structures of advanced Triassic ichthyosaurs, they bear a striking, almost uncanny resemblance to modern dolphins and predatory fish like the bluefin tuna. This is not a biological coincidence, nor is it a sign of direct genetic lineage. It is a mathematical inevitability. The fusiform, or teardrop, body shape is the absolute optimal geometric solution for minimizing hydrodynamic drag while maximizing forward thrust in a dense fluid medium. By the time we reach the mid to late Triassic, the sprawling limbs of their land-dwelling ancestors had flattened into rigid hydrofoils, and their terrestrial spines had thickened and adapted to power a massive crescent-shaped tail. If we project this concept outward into the field of astrobiology, the implications are staggering. On any exoplanet, with liquid oceans, whether composed of water, liquid methane, or subsurface ammonia, mobile macroscopic life forms must navigate the exact same physical equations of fluid dynamics. Because the laws of physics are uniform across the cosmos, it is highly probable that extraterrestrial marine apex predators will share the exact same anatomical silhouette as the ichthyosaurs of the Triassic. Physics, ultimately, is the universal sculptor of biological hardware, but the Triassic oceans push this geometric blueprint to extreme scales, culminating in leviathans like Schistosaurus. Reaching lengths of over 65 feet, Schistosaurus was not just an aquatic reptile, it was a biological submarine representing the maximum structural capacity of early marine vertebrate engineering. However, unlike the classic image of a highly toothed marine predator slicing through prey, paleontological data suggests a completely different biomechanical feeding mechanism for this specific giant. Its skull was unusually short and entirely toothless, indicating that it bypassed the mechanics of biting entirely. Instead, much like modern sperm whales, it likely utilized its massive internal volume to generate a rapid hydrodynamic vacuum, sucking up immense schools of soft-bodied cephalopods. This shift from physical striking to suction feeding at a massive scale represents a highly efficient method of harvesting thermodynamic energy in a deep-water, high-pressure environment. Surviving in the open, pelagic ocean, however, requires more than just hydrodynamic efficiency. It requires a massive internal metabolic furnace. Reptiles are traditionally ectothermic, meaning they rely on external environmental heat to regulate their biological processes. In the deep, cold, and lightless waters of the global ocean, this reliance represents a severe thermal limitation. To overcome this, the ichthyosaurs underwent a radical physiological upgrade. Modern geochemical analysis has provided the definitive proof of this mechanism. By utilizing advanced mass spectrometry to measure the exact ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 isotopes preserved within the fossilized phosphate of ichthyosaur teeth and bones, geochemists can effectively reconstruct the internal body temperature of these animals with astonishing precision. The isotope data is unequivocal. Ichthyosaurs maintained a high, constant internal body temperature, completely independent of the surrounding water. They had achieved endothermy. Commonly known as warm-bloodedness, this metabolic leap fundamentally rewired their ecological potential. A warm-blooded marine reptile can dive deeper, swim faster, and sustain high-speed pursuits for exponentially longer durations than a cold-blooded competitor. It transformed them from passive shoreline ambush hunters into highly active pelagic pursuit predators, allowing them to conquer the frigid, high-latitude oceans that were strictly off-limits to other marine reptiles. But this brings us to a deeper, more precarious reality regarding advanced biological systems. This metabolic engine came with a massive thermodynamic cost. Endothermy requires a continuous, uninterrupted intake of high-density caloric energy to keep the internal furnace running. If the primary oceanic food web fluctuates, this internal heat generation quickly becomes a lethal liability. It is a vulnerability that often dictates the survival or collapse of highly engineered apex predators during planetary disruptions. The more advanced and energy-dependent an organism becomes, the more fragile its existence is when the planetary baseline shifts. Beyond temperature regulation, the most critical biological barrier for a fully aquatic, air-breathing reptile is reproduction. The amniotic egg is a masterpiece of terrestrial evolution, engineered specifically to prevent a developing embryo from dehydrating in the open air. But an eggshell is highly porous, designed to allow the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide with the atmosphere. If a reptile deposits an amniotic egg underwater, the embryo will instantly suffocate and drown. For the early ancestors of the ichthyosaurs, this reproductive barrier meant they were forever tethered to the land, forced to drag their heavy, unaerodynamic bodies onto beaches to nest, much like modern sea turtles. This amphibious lifestyle represented a severe mechanical vulnerability to terrestrial predators and strictly limited their oceanic expansion. To fully sever their ties to the continents and truly conquer the pelagic zone, the ichthyosaurs had to engineer a radical reproductive solution: viviparity, or live birth. The fossil record provides stunning, direct evidence of this mechanism, with numerous specimens perfectly preserved in the exact moment of giving birth to fully formed, free-swimming young. Crucially, the fossils show the infants emerging tail first, an evolutionary adaptation specifically designed to prevent the newborn from drowning during the delivery process. Internal gestation required a complete restructuring of the reptilian reproductive system, trading the biological simplicity and low-energy cost of egg-laying for the massive metabolic and biomechanical investment of carrying heavy embryos within the water column. And it is right here that this biological innovation connects to a larger, planetary-scale narrative. Viviparity is not merely a reproductive strategy. It is a mechanism of absolute ecological liberation. By internalizing the incubation process, ichthyosaurs successfully decoupled their entire life cycle from solid ground. They became the first vertebrate lineage to achieve true independence from the continents, transforming into entirely pelagic entities. In the search for extraterrestrial life on ocean worlds entirely devoid of land masses, such as Jupiter's moon Europa or Saturn's moon Enceladus, this evolutionary mechanism becomes a mandatory threshold. An alien biosphere enclosed entirely by ice and deep water could never utilize an egg-laying phase. It must inherently default to live birth or direct microbial replication. The Triassic ichthyosaurs proved that complex biology can completely abandon the solid Earth. But in doing so, they locked their entire evolutionary destiny to the chemical and thermal stability of the open ocean. If the oceanic chemistry were to suddenly collapse, they had no shores left to return to, a grim reality that perfectly foreshadows the inevitable vulnerability of all highly specialized life forms across deep time. As the Earth transitioned into the Jurassic period, roughly 200 million years ago, the global oceans stabilized, allowing the marine food web to reach unprecedented levels of complexity. While the ichthyosaurs continued to dominate the high-speed pursuit niches near the surface, a completely different biomechanical paradigm began to shadow the depths. This was the era of the pliosaurs, a lineage of short-necked, massive-jawed marine reptiles that utilized a propulsion system never perfectly replicated by any animal on Earth since. For decades, popular media and science fiction heavily distorted our perception of these predators, often exaggerating the size of species like Livyatan to over 80 feet in length to create a cinematic monster. While modern paleontological evidence has corrected this scale to a more realistic 20 to 35 feet, the true horror of the pliosaur was never its sheer mass. It was its absolute terrifying mastery of fluid dynamics. To understand the pliosaur, we must thoroughly examine the physics of underwater flight. Unlike most modern marine mammals or fish that rely on the undulation of a powerful tail, pliosaurs utilized four massive distinct flippers. These were not paddles designed to simply push water backward. If an animal only rose through a dense fluid medium, it wastes a massive amount of metabolic energy fighting hydrodynamic drag, and its top speed is strictly limited by the speed at which it can pull its limb back against the water pressure. Instead, the limbs of the pliosaur evolved into highly rigid, teardrop-shaped hydrofoils, essentially functioning as underwater wings. When they moved these massive limbs in a complex figure-8 motion, the water flowing over the curved upper surface moved faster than the water flowing beneath it. This created a localized pressure differential, generating immense forward and upward lift. They did not swim. They flew through the dense ocean, utilizing the exact same aerodynamic principles that allow modern aircraft to stay in the sky. But the existence of 4 independent wings introduces a profound biomechanical puzzle. In fluid dynamics, operating 2 sets of hydrofoils in close proximity usually creates chaotic, destructive turbulence. The wake from the front wings should theoretically disrupt the water flow for the rear wings, causing them to lose grip and drastically reducing the animal's overall efficiency. To solve this paradox, modern paleontologists could not rely solely on fossilized bones. They had to turn to aerospace engineering by constructing precise robotic models of pliosaur flippers and placing them in advanced computational water tanks and wind tunnels. Researchers were able to visualize the exact flow of water across the predator's body. The data revealed a shocking level of biological synchronization. The front flippers of the pliosaur did indeed create a massive swirling wake of displaced water, but the rear flippers were not hindered by this turbulence. They were explicitly engineered to exploit it. By precisely timing the downstroke of their rear limbs, the predator could actively catch the spinning vortex generated by the front limbs. By pushing against this already moving current, they generated an explosive burst of secondary thrust. This tandem flipper propulsion system allowed for sudden, terrifying acceleration, enabling a multi-ton predator to launch itself from the dark depths and ambush fast-moving prey before the target could even register the change in water pressure. Furthermore, to maintain this high-speed underwater flight without floating to the surface, pliosaurs utilized a fascinating structural adaptation known as pachyostosis. Their skeletal structure, particularly their ribs, was abnormally thick and dense. Because reptiles lack the internal swim bladders found in modern bony fish, they needed a way to achieve neutral buoyancy. This dense bone structure acted exactly like the heavy lead ballast in a modern nuclear submarine, perfectly counteracting the natural buoyancy of their massive lungs. This allowed them to hover silently in the water column, expending zero energy to maintain their depth, waiting for the precise mathematical moment to unleash their tandem flipper strike. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this anatomical structure changes completely. The 4-flipper model of the pliosaur represents one of the most mechanically efficient methods for moving large masses through dense, viscous mediums. When astrobiologists model potential life forms in the subsurface, high-pressure oceans of icy moons like Europa or Enceladus, the tandem hydrofoil design is frequently cited as a highly probable evolutionary endpoint. Because the equations governing lift, drag, and fluid displacement are universal constants across the cosmos, alien apex predators operating under extreme hydrostatic pressure might independently evolve the exact same 4-winged biological architecture. It demonstrates that biology is ultimately subservient to physics. The shape of a supreme predator is dictated not by its genetic origin, but by the unbreakable mathematical properties of the fluid it inhabits. But this leads to a deeper, far more fatal consequence regarding the survival of highly advanced systems. This level of extreme biomechanical optimization creates a dangerous metabolic trap. Operating a 4-engine biological submarine with massive bone ballast requires an uninterrupted, staggering supply of high-density caloric energy. The pliosaurs had engineered themselves to hunt large, specific prey items, effectively placing themselves at the very top of a highly precarious ecological pyramid. Their muscular hydrofoils and massive, crushing jaws capable of snapping an ichthyosaur in half were entirely useless for hunting microscopic plankton or small, agile fish during times of ecological stress. And it is right here that the vulnerability of the apex predator is exposed, mirroring a vital concept in the Great Filter hypothesis. When an organism or even a technological civilization becomes completely hyper-optimized for one specific set of environmental parameters, it loses its systemic resilience. As the Jurassic period eventually gave way to the Cretaceous, subtle tectonic shifts began to slowly alter global ocean currents, triggering localized collapses in the marine food web and reducing the populations of large prey. The pliosaurs, trapped by their own evolutionary perfection, could not adapt their rigid biological hardware. Their massive metabolic engines could not be sustained on a diminishing food supply. Their reign proves that evolutionary invincibility is an illusion. The very physical adaptations that allow a species to completely conquer a stable world become the exact biological anchors that drag them into extinction the moment the planetary parameters shift, leaving the oceanic throne completely empty for the next, even more terrifying phase of reptilian evolution. As the Jurassic period transitioned into the Cretaceous, roughly 145 million years ago, the biological architecture of the oceans underwent another violent restructuring. The reigning dynasties, the rapid ichthyosaurs, and the four-winged pliosaurs began to falter and slowly fade, victims of subtle climatic shifts, altering ocean currents, and the depletion of their highly specific prey bases. Their decline created a massive, unexploited ecological vacuum in the sunlit, shallow seas of the late Cretaceous. To fill this void, nature did not invent an entirely new lineage of marine life. Instead, it reached back to the coastlines, prompting a group of semi-aquatic, terrestrial reptiles to plunge back into the brutal thermodynamic arena of the open ocean. These were the mosasaurs, a specialized branch of squamates closely related to modern monitor lizards and snakes, and they brought with them a terrestrial anatomical weapon that would completely rewrite the mechanics of aquatic predation. The most devastating piece of biological hardware the mosasaurs possessed was the kinetic skull. Unlike the heavy, rigidly fused bone armor of the Devonian placoderms or the solid craniums of modern marine mammals, a mosasaur's skull was a highly dynamic, flexible lattice of bone. They evolved a biomechanical feature known as streptostyle, where the quadrate bone at the back of the skull acted as a swinging hinge, allowing the lower mandible to unhinge and independently drop outward and forward. But the true horror of their anatomy lay hidden on the roof of their mouth, the pterygoid teeth. These were secondary rows of heavy, backward-pointing, recurved teeth situated deep within the upper palate. When a dominant predator, like Tylosaurus, reaching lengths of up to 45 feet, struck its target, it did not need to exert the massive, sustained bite force required to crush bone or tear away chunks of flesh. Instead, the kinetic skull operated like a biological ratchet. As the main jaws clamped down, the pterygoid teeth independently engaged, actively hooking into the struggling prey and mechanically pulling it deeper into the throat. The mosasaur could literally walk its jaws over a victim nearly its own size, swallowing massive armored marine reptiles or giant squids entirely intact. This leads to a profound consequence in metabolic thermodynamics. By swallowing colossal prey whole, the mosasaur bypassed the severe energy expenditure and biomechanical risk associated with death rolls or tearing flesh in a dense fluid medium. The sheer volume of caloric energy absorbed from a single massive kill could fuel their internal metabolic furnace for highly extended periods. It was a strategy of extreme energetic efficiency, allowing them to maintain their massive biological scale without needing to hunt constantly, which is a critical survival mechanism in an ocean where food distribution can be highly chaotic. If we project this anatomical phenomenon outward into the field of astrobiology, it fundamentally changes how we model the evolution of complex life. The mosasaur's kinetic skull demonstrates that evolution is strictly a tinkerer, not an inventor. It never designs perfect structures from scratch. It merely contorts the existing evolutionary baggage of a species' ancestors. On any exoplanet, the dominant marine organisms will likely achieve their supremacy not by evolving entirely new, flawless aquatic organs, but by weaponizing whatever bizarre anatomical quirks they inherited from their evolutionary past. The terrestrial snake-like jaw was not built for the ocean, but once submerged, it became the ultimate mechanism for planetary dominance. But a highly efficient consumption mechanism is completely useless if the predator cannot effectively intercept its prey. For over a century, the actual hydrodynamics of how mosasaurs moved through the water was the subject of intense, often deeply flawed scientific debate. Early paleontologists, observing the highly elongated, serpentine structure of the mosasaur spinal column, defaulted to a simple visual assumption. They proposed that mosasaurs utilized anguilliform locomotion, meaning they swam by undulating their entire elongated bodies through the water in a continuous S-wave, much like a modern moray eel or sea snake. However, as advanced fluid dynamics began to intersect with paleontology, this model presented a severe mechanical paradox. Argilliform swimming is a drag-based propulsion system. It is functional for slow-moving coastal ambush predators navigating through dense coral reefs, but it is astronomically inefficient for a multi-ton animal in the open ocean. If a 40-foot Tylosaurus attempted to slither through the pelagic zone, the hydrodynamic drag generated by its massive undulating surface area would have burned through its caloric reserves in a matter of hours. The math simply did not work. An eel-like mosasaur could never have achieved the high-speed pursuit required to be a globally distributed apex predator. The resolution to this paradox did not come from a better computer simulation, but from a rare, staggering preservation anomaly. In the modern era, excavations in Jordan and other highly specific geological formations uncovered mosasaur fossils that preserve distinct carbonized impressions of the animal's soft tissue. These physical imprints instantly shattered the century-old eel hypothesis. The fossils revealed that mosasaurs did not have a simple paddle-like tail. They possessed a highly advanced, stiffened, hypocercal tail, a massive, crescent-shaped biological propeller, where the downward-bending spinal column supported the lower lobe. This single anatomical revelation completely rewrote the energetic modeling of the Cretaceous ocean. Mosasaurs utilized thunniform locomotion, structurally mirroring the mechanics of modern great white sharks or bluefin tuna. Instead of dragging their entire bodies through the water, they held their elongated torsos rigidly straight to minimize fluid resistance, isolating all their immense muscular output into snapping that highly aerodynamic crescent tail back and forth. This is not drag-based swimming, this is lift-based thrust. The tips of a crescent tail shed water vortices in a way that minimizes turbulence, translating raw muscular power into sustained, explosive forward acceleration. They were not slow coastal ambushers, they were highly pressurized pelagic cruise missiles capable of hunting down the fastest prey the Cretaceous had to offer. And it is right here that this biological perfection connects to a much larger, fatal reality. By upgrading from slow, drag-based swimmers to high-speed, warm-blooded, globally distributed thunniform cruisers, the mosasaurs had engineered themselves into a corner. This level of extreme biomechanical performance is a luxury that demands a colossal, entirely uninterrupted flow of energy from the global food web. The paradox of the apex predator is that the closer a species gets to absolute physical perfection, the more fundamentally fragile it becomes to systemic shocks. If this principle holds true, it serves as a stark warning within the Great Filter hypothesis. The most advanced, high-maintenance systems in any biosphere or any technological civilization are always the first to collapse when the foundational environment shifts. The mosasaurs had successfully conquered the entire globe, utterly unaware that their massive, specialized metabolic engines had left them with absolutely no biological flexibility to survive the sudden, apocalyptic asteroid impact that was silently hurtling toward the Earth. While pelagic cruisers like the mosasaurs dominated the global deepwater oceans, a completely different, highly localized biomechanical experiment was unfolding on the North American continent. During the mid-Cretaceous period, roughly 100 million years ago, a massive geological shift occurred. As the tectonic plates of the Pacific floor subducted beneath the western edge of North America, the immense geological friction pulled the center of the continent downward, creating a massive topographical depression known as a foreland basin. The rising global sea levels subsequently flooded this basin, connecting the cold waters of the Arctic Ocean to the warm currents of the Gulf of Mexico. This event created the Western Interior Seaway, an epicontinental sea that physically divided North America into two distinct landmasses. An epicontinental sea is a shallow ocean resting directly on top of continental crust, and it possesses a radically different thermodynamic profile compared to the open ocean. Because the water column is relatively shallow, typically no deeper than 600 to 900 feet, sunlight can penetrate entirely to the sea floor. This constant solar irradiation, combined with a continuous influx of mineral-rich sediment washing off the newly formed Rocky Mountains, turned the Western Interior Seaway into a hyperproductive biological engine. It supported staggering explosive blooms of phytoplankton, which in turn anchored one of the most densely packed, hyper-carnivorous food webs in planetary history. But this shallow, sun-baked paradise harbored a silent, invisible killer, extreme salinity. Because the seaway was shallow and exposed to intense equatorial heat, it experienced massive evaporation rates. As water evaporated, it left the dissolved minerals behind, transforming the inland sea into a highly concentrated brine. For any air-breathing organism attempting to survive in this environment, this created a severe physiological crisis governed by the fundamental laws of osmosis. In a hypersaline environment, the concentration of salt outside the animal's body is significantly higher than the concentration of fluids within its cells. As a result, the ocean actively attempts to suck the fresh water out of the organism's tissues. If a marine animal drinks seawater to rehydrate, it introduces lethal levels of sodium and chloride ions into its bloodstream, which can rapidly cause neurological failure and cardiac arrest. To conquer this biochemical desert, marine reptiles had to engineer localized biological desalination plants. The ultimate manifestation of this adaptation was Archelon, the largest marine turtle ever recorded, measuring over 15 feet from flipper to flipper. Unlike modern turtles, Archelon lacked a solid, heavy carapace. Instead, its shell was composed of a skeletal framework covered in a thick, leathery hide, a morphological trade-off that vastly reduced its structural weight and increased its buoyancy in the shallow seaway. But its true masterpiece of evolutionary engineering was housed deep within its massive skull. Archelon possessed hypertrophied lacrimal glands, enormous, highly vascularized organs situated just behind its eyes. These salt glands operated on a mechanism known as active transport. At a cellular level, specialized proteins within the gland utilized vast amounts of metabolic energy to forcefully pump sodium and chloride ions out of the bloodstream against the natural osmotic gradient. This highly concentrated brine was then continuously excreted through the animal's tear ducts. Archelon survived in a hypersaline ocean by literally crying out the toxic salt, an incredibly energy-intensive physiological process that allowed it to harvest the dense biological resources of the seaway without slowly desiccating from the inside out. And it is right here that this biochemical mechanism connects to a much larger question regarding the distribution of life across the cosmos. When astrobiologists analyze data from the subsurface oceans of icy moons in our solar system, one of the greatest potential barriers to alien life is extreme salinity. The energy required to maintain cellular homeostasis in a hypersaline fluid is staggering. On an exoplanet with oceans significantly saltier than Earth's, the immense metabolic tax of osmoregulation might permanently prevent the evolution of large, complex organisms. The environment might support simple microbial life, but the energy budget simply would not allow for the construction of massive biological hardware. Archelon demonstrates that overcoming the chemical limits of an ocean requires a massive dedicated allocation of internal energy, a hurdle that many alien biospheres may never mathematically cross. But marine reptiles were not the only leviathans attempting to master the chemistry of the western interior seaway. The late Cretaceous also witnessed the terrifying rise of giant teleosts, or advanced bony fish. The apex of this lineage was Xiphactinus, a 20-foot-long predatory fish equipped with a heavily armored, bulldog-like skull and massive interlocking fangs. Unlike Archelon, Xiphactinus regulated its internal salinity using specialized chloride cells located directly within the filaments of its massive gills, allowing it to continuously process salt water during high-speed respiration. The existence of Xiphactinus provides a stark observational window into the frantic, hyper-aggressive nature of this localized ecosystem. One of the most famous paleontological discoveries in history is a completely intact fossil of a 14-foot Xiphactinus that contains the perfectly preserved articulated skeleton of a 6-foot fish, known as Gillicus, completely whole inside its stomach. This specific fossil data provides crucial insight into the trophic dynamics of the seaway. Because teleost fish lacked the kinetic skulls of the mosasaurs and the shearing jaws of the ancient placoderms, they could not efficiently dismember large prey. Instead, they relied on massive ram-feeding strikes, swallowing highly active, large-mass targets whole. The specimen died not from predation, but from the violent internal trauma of its own gluttony, indicating a food web driven by extreme metabolic urgency and instantaneous high-risk energy transfer. However, the very geological mechanism that created this hyperproductive ecosystem was fundamentally unstable. The epicontinental sea was not a permanent fixture of the Earth. It was merely a temporary puddle resting on a moving tectonic plate. As the Cretaceous period drew to a close, the angle of the subducting Pacific plate began to shallow. This geological shift, known as the Laramide orogeny, effectively pushed the interior of the North American continent upward. The ground literally rose beneath the seaway. This leads to a profound existential consequence. The western interior seaway was not destroyed by an asteroid or a sudden atmospheric collapse. It simply drained away. As the continental crust rebounded, the water flowed back into the deep ocean basins, and the vast, vibrant marine ecosystem was entirely erased, replaced by dry plains and eventually forests. This mechanism perfectly illustrates the sheer fragility of complex biospheres. An ecosystem can achieve a state of immense biological diversity and hyperspecialization, yet its entire existence is completely subservient to the slow, invisible grinding of tectonic plates. In the context of our own technological civilization, it is a sobering reminder that the current coastlines, the stability of our oceans, and the climate we rely upon are geologically ephemeral. We are building permanent structures in a world that is inherently designed to change its shape, a reality that dictates the ultimate lifespan of any civilization anchored to a dynamically active planet. 66 million years ago, a massive asteroid impact completely sterilized the upper tiers of the marine food web. The highly optimized biological machines of the Cretaceous, the thunniform mosasaurs, and the long-necked plesiosaurs, were instantaneously permanently deleted from the planetary operating system. This catastrophic clearing of ecological niches created yet another massive biological vacuum. But the oceans that recovered in the subsequent Paleogene period were not the same oceans the reptiles had conquered. The planetary climate engine was about to undergo a radical, runaway acceleration. Roughly 56 million years ago, the Earth entered a phase known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Over a geologically brief period of just a few thousand years, an unimaginably vast quantity of carbon dioxide and methane was injected directly into the atmosphere. The exact trigger remains a subject of intense scientific debate, ranging from massive volcanic outgassing in the North Atlantic to the sudden destabilization of frozen methane hydrates on the ocean floor. Regardless of the catalyst, the chemical consequence was absolute. Global temperatures spiked drastically, warming the oceans by up to 8 degrees Celsius from the surface, completely down to the abyssal depths. The polar ice caps were entirely absent, and tropical conditions extended into the high latitudes. At a planetary scale, the significance of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum changes our perspective entirely. It acts as a perfect geological mirror for rapid atmospheric carbon loading, a mechanism that tests the absolute thermal limits of a global biosphere. In the context of astrobiology and the longevity of technological civilizations, this event is heavily studied as a potential natural great filter. If a planet's biological or geological processes can spontaneously release enough greenhouse gases to rapidly acidify and superheat its oceans, it demonstrates that terrestrial worlds are inherently equipped with self-destruct mechanisms. A civilization does not necessarily need nuclear weapons to face extinction. It simply needs to misunderstand the thermal capacity of its own atmosphere. In these superheated, highly stratified Paleogene oceans, a new lineage of predators stepped off the continents to claim the vacant throne. But this time, they were not reptiles, they were mammals. The undisputed apex predator of this sweltering epoch was Basilosaurus, an early ancestral whale that pushed mammalian anatomy into deeply bizarre territory. Reaching lengths of over 60 feet, Basilosaurus completely abandoned the teardrop, hydrodynamic efficiency of modern dolphins or ancient ichthyosaurs. Instead, it adopted a highly elongated, serpentine morphology, possessing a spinal column packed with dense, fluid-filled vertebrae. Why would evolution deliberately engineer a mammal to look and move like a colossal snake? The answer lies in the specific geological parameters of its hunting grounds. Basilosaurus did not primarily hunt in the deep, open ocean. It thrived in the Tethys Sea, a vast, warm, highly productive, epicontinental seaway that divided the land masses of Africa and Eurasia. This environment was dominated by shallow, complex reef systems and dense coastal mangrove forests. In this highly obstructed aquatic terrain, the rigid, high-speed, thunniform bodies of previous apex predators would have been a massive mechanical disadvantage, preventing them from turning tightly to pursue prey. Basilosaurus sacrificed straight-line pelagic speed for extreme axial flexibility. It reverted to an ankyliform swimming style, undulating its massive, elongated body to silently weave through the shallow reef structures. But the anatomy of its skeleton is only a fraction of its biomechanical story. The true limitation of Basilosaurus, and the mechanism that ultimately sealed its fate, was hidden deep within the structural engineering of its skull. To understand this vulnerability, we must examine the physics of underwater acoustics. In the atmosphere, sound waves travel slowly and lose energy rapidly. In liquid water, sound is amplified, traveling over 4 times faster and covering immense distances. Modern, toothed whales and dolphins have weaponized this physical property through echolocation, emitting high-frequency clicks and reading the returning echoes to build a highly detailed, 3-dimensional acoustic map of their surroundings. To achieve this, modern whales possess highly specialized auditory hardware. Their inner ear bones, specifically the tympanic bulla, are completely disconnected from the rest of their skull, suspended entirely by a network of ligaments and surrounded by specialized acoustic fats. This biological acoustic isolation is mandatory in water. Because a mammalian body is composed mostly of water, underwater sound waves will vibrate the entire skull simultaneously. If the ear bones are fused to the skull, the brain receives the sound from all directions at once, making it mathematically impossible to determine the origin of the sound. When paleontologists utilized high-resolution computed tomography, scanning on the fossilized skulls of Basilosaurus, the data revealed a fatal sensory flaw. While its ear bones were enlarged, they remained partially fused to the surrounding cranium. It lacked the dense, isolated acoustic hardware and the specialized fatty melon organ required to direct or receive high-frequency sonar. Basilosaurus was completely incapable of echolocation. It was an apex predator trapped by the limitations of its terrestrial ancestry, entirely dependent on visual target acquisition and basic, low-frequency directional hearing. This leads to a profound evolutionary consequence. Because Basilosaurus was visually dependent, its hunting grounds were strictly dictated by the penetration of solar radiation. It was a prisoner of the photic zone. It could not hunt in the deep, abyssal waters, nor could it navigate efficiently at night or in highly turbid environments. While the Tethys Sea remained shallow, warm, and sunlit, this sensory limitation was manageable. But the geological stability of the planet was an illusion. As the Eocene epoch marched toward its conclusion, the global climate engine violently reversed. The slow collision of the Indian subcontinent with Eurasia began to force the Himalayan mountains upward, creating a massive new carbon sink that rapidly pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The planet plunged into a sudden cooling phase. Ocean currents shifted. The ice caps began to freeze and global sea levels plummeted. The shallow, tropical Tethys Sea, the very environment that dictated the serpentine shape and visual dependency of Basilosaurus, literally drained away and fractured. When forced out into the newly forming, frigid, and deep open oceans, the hardware of this early whale completely failed. Its elongated body was utterly inefficient for long-distance pelagic cruising, and its lack of acoustic sonar meant it could not follow its prey into the darkening depths. The ultimate mammalian predator of the Paleogene was erased not by a sudden catastrophe, but by a slow, relentless shift in the thermodynamic and acoustic properties of the global ocean. As the global climate plunged into a severe cooling phase during the Neogene period, roughly 23 million years ago, the architecture of the oceans fundamentally transformed. The formation of permanent ice caps at the poles established intense temperature gradients across the globe. This immense thermal differential became the engine for powerful new ocean currents, which scoured the deep ocean floor and forced massive upwellings of nutrient-rich water to the surface. This geological terraforming triggered a biological explosion of phytoplankton, followed immediately by vast swarms of krill, which in turn fueled the evolution of massive, filter-feeding baleen whales. The oceans had effectively concentrated millions of tons of biological energy into massive, slow-moving packages of blubber and muscle. And wherever biology concentrates energy, evolution inevitably engineers a highly specialized machine designed to extract it. This thermodynamic opportunity gave rise to the ultimate cartilaginous predator, Otodus Megalodon. However, constructing an accurate scientific model of this Leviathan exposes a profound vulnerability in our understanding of deep time. Because Megalodon was a shark, its entire skeletal structure was composed of cartilage, a highly flexible tissue that rapidly disintegrates long before it can fossilize. The only physical data this apex predator left behind in the geological record are its teeth. These teeth are masterpieces of biomineralization, constructed from tightly interwoven crystals of calcium phosphate and heavily fortified with fluorine. This specific chemical matrix, known as fluorapatite, makes the teeth incredibly hard and highly resistant to environmental degradation. But this remarkable preservation creates a severe scientific limitation. For over a century, the entire biological morphology, swimming mechanics, and behavioral ecology of a 50-foot animal have been mathematically extrapolated from a single anatomical variable: the width and height of its isolated teeth. This introduces a massive margin of error into our paleontological models. For decades, the standard scientific practice was to simply take the anatomical proportions of a modern great white shark and scale them up to match the size of the fossilized teeth. But modern biomechanical modeling and fluid dynamics have shattered this simplistic assumption. The great white is a pursuit predator, optimized for sudden bursts of speed to catch highly agile seals. Megalodon was hunting entirely different prey in an entirely different thermodynamic landscape. Recent studies utilizing stable isotope analysis from the enameloid of its teeth suggest that Megalodon was not just a scaled-up modern shark, but a significantly bulkier, structurally distinct lineage. It was engineered not for high-speed, sustained pelagic pursuit, but for catastrophic, high-impact collisions. To understand the true horror of Megalodon, we must examine the physical evidence of its biomechanical attack strategy. When paleontologists analyze the fossilized remains of small baleen whales from the Neogene, they frequently discover massive vertebrae and thick rib bones deeply scarred with parallel serrated gouges. These are not scavenging marks. They are the chemical and physical signatures of a highly specific surgical strike. A modern great white typically attacks the soft underbelly or the rear flippers of its prey to cripple it while avoiding damage to its own jaws. Megalodon completely ignored this cautious strategy. The fossil data clearly indicates that it actively targeted the heavily armored thoracic cavity of the whale. This leads to a profound realization about the physics of ancient marine combat. Megalodon did not just bite its prey, it functioned as a biological kinetic energy weapon. By accelerating its massive bulk upward from the dark depths, it rammed the whale precisely at the rib cage. The immense impact force, combined with a bite pressure estimated at over 40,000 pounds per square inch, was designed to instantaneously shatter the ribs, driving the splintered bone directly into the whale's heart and lungs. This catastrophic structural failure induced immediate hydrostatic shock, disabling the prey before it could even attempt to flee. But engineering a biological machine capable of delivering this level of kinetic devastation comes with a staggering, inescapable metabolic tax. To generate the raw muscular power required for these high-speed impacts in cold, upwelling waters, Megalodon could not rely on the standard, cold-blooded metabolism of most fish. It utilized regional endothermy, a complex physiological network of specialized blood vessels known as iridia mirabilia. This countercurrent heat exchange system allowed the shark to trap the metabolic heat generated by its massive swimming muscles, keeping its core temperature, eyes, and brain significantly warmer than the surrounding ocean. It was a massive biological furnace operating in a freezing environment, and it is right here that this incredible biological hardware connects to a much larger, planetary-scale narrative regarding the survival of highly advanced systems. Megalodon achieved the absolute pinnacle of predatory dominance, but in doing so, it became entirely enslaved by its own extreme energy requirements. A multi-ton, warm-blooded kinetic weapon must consume an astronomical amount of high-density caloric energy every single day just to prevent its internal furnace from stalling. It was completely, irreversibly dependent on a high population of small, easily accessible baleen whales. In the broader context of astrobiology and the lifespan of civilizations, this biological dependency serves as a perfect model for a thermodynamic great filter. Whether we are analyzing a hyper-specialized apex predator in the Neogene ocean or a highly advanced technological civilization dependent on a single, finite energy grid, the mathematical reality remains identical. Extreme scale demands extreme environmental stability. The moment the foundational energy source fluctuates, the largest and most complex systems are the first to collapse. Megalodon was completely blind to the fact that its evolutionary perfection was actually a metabolic trap. Furthermore, as it patrolled the global oceans, it was not the only Livyatan exploiting this energy-rich food web. It had to share the seas with a completely different branch of evolution, a rival lineage that had weaponized mammalian intelligence and echolocation, setting the stage for a clash of biological titans that would test the absolute limits of the Neogene ecosystem. While Megalodon ruled the coastal upwelling zones as the ultimate cartilaginous kinetic weapon, it did not possess an absolute monopoly over the Neogene oceans. The evolutionary arms race of the epoch had produced a parallel apex predator, one that arrived at extreme gigantism through an entirely different biological lineage. This was Livyatan melvilli, a macroraptorial sperm whale that represented the absolute pinnacle of mammalian cranial engineering. The discovery of Livyatan in the coastal deserts of Peru shattered the assumption that Megalodon was the sole undisputed titan of its era. Instead, the global ocean was a divided empire shared by two distinct hypermetabolic leviathans. Understanding how these two biological machines coexisted without immediately driving each other into extinction requires a deep dive into the anatomical physics of the mammalian skull and the strict mathematical laws of ecological economics. Unlike the cartilaginous skeleton of a shark, which flexes and absorbs impact, the skull of Livyatan was a massive, heavily ossified fortress of solid bone measuring 10 feet in length. This rigid architectural framework was required to support the most devastating set of gripping weapons ever evolved by a vertebrate. While Megalodon teeth were flat, serrated blades designed to slice cleanly through tissue and bone, the teeth of Livyatan were conical, deeply rooted spikes, some measuring over 14 inches long. These are the largest functional teeth of any known animal in planetary history. This distinct dental morphology points to a fundamentally different biomechanical kill strategy. Livyatan was not a hit-and-run ramming vessel. Its deep temporal fossae, the depressions in the skull that house the jaw muscles, indicate an immense, sustained bite force. When Livyatan struck, its massive conical teeth were designed to completely penetrate the deep tissue of its prey, locking the target in an inescapable physical vice. It utilized a gripping and tearing mechanism, relying on the sheer structural integrity of its fused bone skull to withstand the violent, multi-directional torsional forces of a struggling, multi-ton prey item. But the true biological marvel of Livyatan was situated not in its jaw, but resting on the roof of its skull. The cranium of this ancient whale features a massive concave supracranial basin, In modern sperm whales, this anatomical depression houses the spermaceti organ, a colossal biological structure filled with specialized liquid waxes and acoustic fats. This organ functions as a highly advanced acoustic lens. By forcing air through phonic lips and bouncing the resulting sound waves off the parabolic bone of the skull, the whale can focus and amplify high-frequency clicks. The spermaceti wax alters its density based on temperature, allowing the animal to actively tune the acoustic impedance of the sound wave before it enters the water. If Livyatan possessed a highly developed spermaceti organ, it was not merely a predator, it was a highly advanced sensory platform. Water is an incredibly dense medium where light penetrates poorly, but where sound travels over 4 times faster than in the atmosphere. While Megalodon was largely dependent on visual and electromagnetic sensory input in the sunlit zones, Livyatan could theoretically weaponize sound. Some acoustic models suggest that macroraptorial whales could generate directional sonic clicks so intense that the localized acoustic pressure could physically disorient or temporarily paralyze the nervous systems of their prey. Even without acoustic stunning, advanced echolocation granted Livyatan total navigational and predatory supremacy in the abyssal, lightless depths, a thermodynamic zone entirely off-limits to the visually dependent Megalodon. This massive divergence in sensory and biomechanical hardware brings us to one of the most critical laws of biology, the competitive exclusion principle. In any enclosed ecosystem, 2 highly specialized species cannot indefinitely occupy the exact same ecological niche. If Megalodon and Livyatan hunted the exact same prey in the exact same environments using the exact same methods, the mathematics of thermodynamics dictate that one would rapidly outcompete and starve the other. To survive simultaneously, these 2 superpredators engaged in a phenomenon known as niche partitioning. They effectively divided the thermodynamic resources of the global ocean. Megalodon optimized itself for the epipelagic zone, utilizing sudden vertical strikes to harvest the massive populations of small, filter-feeding baleen whales in the warm coastal waters. Livyatan, armed with advanced echolocation, a crushing bite, and mammalian diving physiology, likely partitioned the food web by targeting entirely different prey. It could plunge into the deep aphotic zones to hunt giant cephalopods or target larger, more dangerous marine mammals that Megalodon's shearing teeth were not mechanically equipped to handle. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this coexistence changes our perspective entirely. The Neogene Ocean managed to support 2 highly advanced, warm-blooded, multi-ton apex predators simultaneously. In the context of biospheric modeling and astrobiology, this represents the absolute maximum carrying capacity of an aquatic ecosystem. When we search for life on exoplanets, a partitioned apex tier like this implies an underlying biosphere of staggering, almost unimaginable caloric abundance. It demonstrates that when planetary conditions are perfectly stable, evolution will relentlessly engineer multiple, highly specialized methods to harvest every available drop of biological energy. But this leads to a severe systemic vulnerability. Niche partitioning is a delicate thermodynamic truce. It relies entirely on the continuous, uninterrupted flow of a vast, highly diverse prey base. If the ocean's energy grid fluctuates, the partition instantly collapses. As the geological clock ticked forward, the Earth's climate was preparing to shift dramatically once again, threatening to erase the very biological abundance that allowed these 2 titans to share the world. When the thermodynamic floor falls out from beneath an ecosystem, the most specialized, high-energy biological machines are always the first to starve. For millions of years, the delicate thermodynamic truce between the Neogene superpredators held firm, sustained by a global ocean that freely circulated warm equatorial waters around the Earth. But roughly 3 million years ago, during the Pliocene epoch, the foundational geometry of the planet shifted. The catalyst for the greatest marine extinction event since the asteroid impact was not a sudden explosion or a toxic atmospheric plume. It was a slow, silent geological collision as the Caribbean and South American tectonic plates ground against each other. volcanic activity pushed a narrow, highly unstable strip of rock above the surface of the water. This was the formation of the Isthmus of Panama. At a localized scale, the creation of this land bridge merely connected North and South America. But at a planetary scale, the meaning of this geographical shift changes entirely. By closing the Central American Seaway, the Isthmus of Panama effectively severed the primary equatorial current that flowed between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The warm, highly saline water of the Caribbean suddenly had nowhere to go but north. This forced deflection created a massive, high-speed thermal conveyor belt that we now know as the Gulf Stream. This leads to a profound and highly counterintuitive climatological consequence. One might assume that pushing vast quantities of warm water toward the Arctic would heat the northern hemisphere. Instead, it triggered a global freeze. As the warm Gulf Stream reached the frigid northern latitudes, massive amounts of moisture evaporated into the cold air. This moisture subsequently fell as unprecedented volumes of snow across the northern continents. Because snow is highly reflective, it dramatically increased the Earth's albedo. The amount of solar radiation bounced back into space. The planet began to cool rapidly, locking vast quantities of the ocean's water into permanent advancing polar ice caps, plunging the Earth directly into the Pleistocene ice ages. And it is right here that this geological mechanism connects to a much larger existential question about the longevity of complex life. The formation of the Isthmus of Panama demonstrates that a global biosphere is entirely at the mercy of continental drift. In the context of astrobiology and the Fermi paradox, this reveals a silent, deeply structural great filter. A highly advanced, technologically capable civilization on an exoplanet could easily map its genome, harness nuclear power, and build global infrastructure, only to be systematically eradicated because a tectonic plate shifted a few dozen miles, permanently altering the oceanic currents and collapsing the planetary climate engine. Geology is destiny, and carbon-based life is merely a passenger on a rocky machine it cannot control. As the polar ice caps expanded, global sea levels plummeted by hundreds of feet. For the marine ecosystem, this was a systemic catastrophe. The warm, shallow epicontinental seas and coastal shelves, which had served as the hyperproductive nurseries for baleen whales and countless other marine species, physically drained away and became dry land. The biological density of the ocean was suddenly fractured. To survive this thermal and geographical collapse, baleen whales were forced into a radical evolutionary pivot. They engineered incredibly thick layers of insulating blubber and migrated toward the extreme northern and southern latitudes, where cold, nutrient-rich upwellings supported massive blooms of krill. But this migration snapped the macro food chain entirely. Megalodon, despite its regional endothermy and massive internal metabolic furnace, was fundamentally tethered to temperate and tropical waters. It could not follow the whales into the freezing polar oceans. The thermal drain on its body would have induced rapid cardiac failure. Furthermore, with the coastal shelves exposed as dry land, Megalodon lost its critical pupping grounds. The juvenile sharks, devoid of shallow water sanctuaries, were exposed to starvation and predation. Livyatan faced an identical, insurmountable crisis. The macroraptorial sperm whale, relying on a localized, highly specific prey base of large marine mammals, watched its food source either adapt to the ice or go extinct. The highly partitioned ecological niches that allowed both superpredators to coexist instantly dissolved. There was no longer enough biological energy in the equatorial oceans to support even one multi-ton apex predator, let alone two. The extinction of Megalodon and Livyatan proves that extreme anatomical perfection is an evolutionary illusion. Their massive bite forces, kinetic impact strategies, and advanced acoustic sensory platforms were completely useless against a drop in ocean temperature and the disappearance of coastlines. They were the ultimate biological machines engineered for a world that simply ceased to exist. Their eradication cleared the apex tier of the ocean one final time, leaving behind a fundamentally altered, cold water world that would eventually be inherited by a new lineage of highly social, pack-hunting cetaceans, modern killer whales, who prioritized acoustic communication, coordinated intelligence, and adaptability over sheer brute force gigantism. When we survey hundreds of millions of years of marine evolution, a clear, inescapable pattern emerges. We tend to view apex predators, the giant sea scorpions, the heavily armored placoderms, the highly kinetic mosasaurs, and the massive Megalodon, as the ultimate victors of biology. We perceive their staggering size and devastating weaponry as the absolute finish line of the evolutionary race. But the fossil record reveals a deeply counterintuitive, almost tragic truth. Absolute biological dominance is not a permanent state of victory, it is an ecological trap. The fatal flaw of the apex predator lies in the thermodynamics of gigantism. Achieving massive scale and extreme biomechanical specialization, whether it is generating a localized hydrodynamic vacuum, powering a warm-blooded metabolic furnace in freezing waters, or supporting a multi-ton bone skull, requires a staggering, uninterrupted flow of high-density caloric energy. This creates an inescapable metabolic burden. A biological machine can only become that large and powerful if the planetary environment remains perfectly stable, effectively subsidizing its massive energy costs through continuous ecological abundance. But as we have seen across deep time, planets are fundamentally unstable engines. Tectonic plates collide and fracture, actively rerouting global ocean currents. Biological innovations on land trigger sudden algal blooms that suffocate the seas. When the planetary baseline fluctuates, the foundational food web inevitably collapses. In these moments of global geological crisis, the most advanced, highly engineered organisms completely lack the biological flexibility to adapt. Their massive size, once their greatest evolutionary advantage, instantaneously transforms into a metabolic anchor that drags them into extinction. It is a universal rule: the highly specialized perish, while the small, the generalized, and the adaptable survive to inherit the devastated oceans, starting the evolutionary cycle entirely anew. If we project this physical reality outward into the cosmos, it speaks to a universal thermodynamic law. In the field of astrobiology, this mechanism acts as a critical component of the Great Filter hypothesis. If we eventually discover complex life on other ocean worlds, we will mathematically find that hyperspecialization is a universal dead end. Any biological system that engineers itself perfectly for a single, specific set of environmental parameters virtually guarantees its own total eradication when the host planet inevitably shifts its climate. And it is right here that the deep history of the oceans offers a chilling reflection on the lifespan of intelligent life. A highly advanced global technological civilization operates on the exact same principles as a prehistoric superpredator. We have constructed massive, hyper-specialized infrastructural networks that demand a continuous, staggering supply of energy. We have optimized our entire existence for the current, highly fragile climate baseline. The terrifying lesson of the ancient oceans is that no entity is too large, too powerful, or too advanced to fail. The prehistoric sea monsters were not evolutionary mistakes. They were the absolute most perfect machines their environments could mathematically produce. But they were ultimately subservient to the slow, invisible, and violent geological forces of a dynamic planet. Their fossilized remains stand as a permanent reminder that survival in this universe does not go to the largest, the most heavily armored, or the most dominant. Survival belongs exclusively to those who can adapt when the world beneath them suddenly changes its shape.